VMware Server installs like an application on Windows or Linux machine. Once installed on a computer, this computer becomes what is referred to as the host computer. In other words, this computer is now hosting the VMware Server application and will be hosting virtual machines. As virtual machines get created, they become guest operating systems that run on the host computer. A guest operating system can be Windows, Linux, or other type of supported operating system that's supported by VMware Server. Guest operating systems run on the host computer. How many operating systems are running in this picture? There are 4. The operating system that the host operating system is running, and 3 for the virtual machines. The guest operating system is made up of a series of files that are stored on the host operating system. Later modules will discuss what each of these files are. For now, it's important to understand that the guest operating system is stored as a series of files on the host. The guest operating system shares hardware with other guests on the same host operating system. The CPU, memory, disk, and network resources of the host computer are used by the guest operating system, thereby increasing the utilization of the host computer. Virtual machines on the same host are isolated from one another, so that if one virtual machine fails, it won't affect the other running virtual machines on the same host. Every virtual machine that is created with VMware Server gets its own virtual hardware the guest operating system can use. This virtual hardware is not the same hardware that the host computer uses. For example, the virtual machine sees a physical disk. However, that physical disk in reality is just a file that exists on the host computer's hard disk drive. A virtual machine can use up to 2 virtual processors and can use up to 3.6 gigabytes of memory. Every virtual machine has a console that you access from the VMware Server application that gives you total control of the guest operating system. This console can even be run in full screen mode on your host system to allow you to work with the guest the same way you would a physical guest. Access from the VMware Server application. One benefit of working with virtual machines is that you have more flexibility in working with the way data is stored. Can even be run virtual machines all have virtual hard disk drives that are stored as files on the host operating system's hard drive. These virtual hard disks can have snapshots associated with them that store only the changes while leaving the original disk unchanged. This is useful if you need to return the virtual machine to a known state for testing or for development. Many networking options exist with virtual machines to give you flexibility in configuring how the virtual machines communicate with each other on the network. 3 options exist for setting up the virtual machine networking: bridged, NAT, and host only. Bridge networking means that the virtual machine has a unique identity on the same network as the host computer. In this example, the virtual machine appears on the network just as it would if it were a physical machine. When using NAT networking, the virtual machines do not appear on the physical network. Instead, the VMware Server creates a private network for the virtual machine, providing them DHCP and NAT services. The virtual machines can only get access to the network going through the NAT service provided by the VMware Server. With host-only networking, a private network is created between the VMware Server host and the virtual machines. The virtual machines can communicate with each other, however, they cannot communicate outside of the VMware host. This is useful when you want to do testing off of the production network. Server. To download VMware Server, from the VMware main page, choose the Products menu and click Server Virtualization Products. From the Server Virtualization Products screen, what you want to do next is click VMware Server. You can see a link on the VMware Server page for Download Now. So I'm going to click Download Now. And in order to use VMware Server, I'm going to need a serial number, so I'm going to click Register for your free serial number. What I'm going to do is fill out this page that will allow me to get a serial number by filling out some information about myself. Now I've got all the required information filled out, I can click Submit, and that will take me to a download page. Click on the link that says Download Now, but don't forget to save your serial number. So right click and copy it to the clipboard, and then click Download Now. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page and click Yes for the end user license agreement, and then I'm taken to a screen where I can choose between downloading Windows versions of VMware Server or Linux versions. I'm going to choose VMware Server for Windows and choose the binary.exe, and I'm going to save that to a VMware Server folder I created on my C drive. And click Save, and this will take a few minutes to download. One of the requirements of installing VMware Server is that if you plan to use the MUI, then on your host machine where you're going to install VMware Server, you need to have IIS installed. So today we're going to show you how to install IIS. If you go to your machine and click on Start, choose Settings and then Control Panel. From here, select Add or Remove Programs. This will bring up the Windows Add and Remove Programs dialog box. Click Add or Remove Windows Components and select Application Server and click Details. From here, select Internet Information Services and click OK. Click Next and it'll begin installing Internet Information Services on your machine. The setup will take a few minutes to run. And click Finish to complete the installation wizard. After the installation completes, you can go to the Internet Information Services Manager by clicking on Start, Programs, Administrative Tools, Internet Information Services Manager. By default, the IIS Manager installs a default website. You can view that by drilling down on your server, going to Websites, and finding the default website. If you don't want the default website to run, you can simply click Stop. The default website is not needed for the VMware Server MUI. Today we're going to install VMware Server. We'll run the installer that we downloaded. Here on the Welcome screen, we'll simply click the Next button. We'll go ahead and accept the license agreement, and we'll click the Next button. At the Setup Type screen, we're going to choose a complete installation today. I'm going to go ahead and take the default folder, which is C Program Files VMware, for the installation and click Next. At this screen, the installer tells me that my machine currently has the CD Auto Run enabled, and that Auto Run can have unexpected interactions with virtual machines. So I'm going to go ahead and let the installer disable Auto Run and click Next. And click on Install to begin installing the components. The installer will take a few minutes to install all of the components. After the install is completed, we'll be prompted for customer information such as username, organization, and the serial number that we got earlier when we registered our product. So I'm going to put the serial number in, choose Enter, and the installation wizard's complete. So I'm going to click Finished, and VMware Server is now installed. We'll create a virtual machine with VMware Server using the VMware Server console. To create a new virtual machine, click the button New Virtual Machine, then click Next when the new virtual machine wizard starts. For this example, we will create a virtual machine with the typical options, so go ahead and select Typical, then click Next. We're going to create a Windows XP virtual machine, so select Windows XP Professional and click Next. Now we need to give the virtual machine a name. So for this example, I'm going to name the virtual machine John XP, and I'm going to place it in the C:\VM John XP subdirectory, and go ahead and click Next. Next, we need to select the networking type. I'll use bridge networking because that will give this new virtual machine direct access to the external network. Some other options that you see here are going to be discussed in later modules, so go ahead and click Next. Now we're prompted to enter the disk size. This will be the size of the hard drive that's going to be allocated for the virtual machine. I'm going to take the default size here and click Finish, and our virtual machine is going to begin creating. Once the virtual machine is installed, the very next step would be to install an operating system on the virtual machine. To install an operating system on the virtual machine, we're going to need to be able to boot the virtual machine off some type of boot media. In order to set the virtual machine to boot off of a CD, for example, I need to edit the virtual machine settings. And I click on CD-ROM. Now in this case, I have a choice of using a physical CD-ROM device, or I'm going to choose the option to use an ISO image, and I'm going to browse to my local hard drive, because I have an ISO image which I'm going to attempt to boot off of, called WinISO. And I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to power on the virtual machine by going up to the toolbar and clicking the Power On button. And I'm going to boot to an XP install CD, which is going to then begin installing Windows XP onto my virtual machine. Now this setup is going to take a few minutes, but when I'm done, I'll have a running virtual machine that's running Windows XP. And that's it. The XP operating system is now installed on our virtual machine, and I can log on to it by clicking the OK button, and my operating system is officially installed. Today we're going to look at how to install virtual machine tools into a guest operating system. Virtual machine tools are typically the first thing that are installed once you install a guest operating system on VMware Server. The tools supply optimized drivers for the virtual machine. So to install and click Install VMware Tools. When you get the dialog message, go ahead and click Install, and that's going to mount a CD-ROM drive to our virtual machine. We can see that CD-ROM drive as the D drive in our virtual machine, and we can go to that D drive and launch the setup utility. The setup utility will start the VMware Tools installer. At the welcome screen, go ahead and click Next. And we're going to do a complete install. Now the reason we're going to do a complete install is this is going to make the virtual machine its most portable as we move between different VMware products, such as ESX Server or VMware Workstation. Complete gives us the ability to easily move the virtual machine from one environment to another. So we'll click Next, and we'll click Install to begin the installation. Now the install will take a few minutes, and after the installation is complete, we will need to reboot the virtual machine. Once the installation is complete, click Finish, and then click Yes to restart the virtual machine. Once the virtual machine completes its reboot, go ahead and log into the virtual machine. A couple of ways that we'll know the VMware tools are installed. One way is that we'll have much better display settings available to us now, so we can raise the virtual machine screen resolution up to something that'll be a little bit more visible. Another way that we'll know that virtual machine tools are running is by looking in the system tray. We'll be able to see a VMware Tools icon down in the lower right hand corner. If we double click on the system tray, we'll see the VMware Tools property dialog box appear. That'll give us some options such as time synchronization and showing the VMware tools in the toolbar. When we click OK, we close the VMware Tools properties box. And now VMware Tools has been successfully installed. Fastest way to create a virtual machine in VMware Server. The fastest way to create a new virtual machine in VMware Server is to create a copy of an existing virtual disk and then make a new virtual machine based on that virtual disk. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go to my C drive. I'm going to go to the VM folder where I created my first virtual machine, John XP. And I'm going to make a copy of the virtual disk that's in that folder by copying two files, the Windows XP Professional.vmdk and the Windows XP Professional Flat.vmdk. These two files represent the virtual machine disk for my virtual machine. I'm going to make a copy of those, and I'm going to create a new folder called XP Clone. And I'm going to paste those two files into that folder. Now that the files have been copied into this folder, my next step would be to open up VMware Server and create a new virtual machine. But this time when I create a virtual machine, I'm not going to create a new disk. Instead, I'm going to base the virtual machine on this virtual disk that I just copied. From the VMware Server console menu, I'm going to click New Virtual Machine. And in the New Virtual Machine wizard, I'm going to click Next. This time when I run the New Virtual Machine wizard, I'm going to choose Custom rather than Typical. Custom is going to give me a few more options that I didn't have when I ran the Typical wizard. One of the options Custom is going to give me is the ability to create my virtual machine based upon an existing virtual disk. So again, I'm going to go and choose Windows XP Professional as my operating system and click Next. And I'm going to call this XP Clone, and I'm going to place this virtual machine in the VM XP Clone folder that I created earlier when I made a copy of the virtual disk. When I click Next, I'll get a warning indicating that there's already a virtual machine disk in this folder. That's fine, that's what I want, so I'm going to click Yes. In the Set Access Rights screen, I'm just going to currently go ahead and leave the virtual machine marked as private, and I'm going to leave the Startup Shutdown options as default. The number of processors for the virtual machine is going to be 1, and I'm going to take the default for memory, and I'm going to take the default for networking. For I/O adapter types, I really don't care because I plan to use an IDE adapter anyway, so I'm going to take the default and click Next. This is the step where I'm going to choose to select an existing virtual disk. So I'm going to choose Use Existing Virtual Disk and then click Next. Now I'll have to browse to the file location where I created the virtual disk. And because I happen to be in the same folder, I can just choose Windows Professional.vmdk, and now I can click Finish. Now I have a new virtual machine created, and notice the configuration file location is the VM XP Clone Windows XP Professional.vmx. So that's where we copied the virtual machine disk, and that's where the new virtual machine's been created. Now I'm going to power this virtual machine on and access the console. I'm going to log on to my virtual machine, and now I want to give my virtual machine a new identity because right now it's a duplicate copy of my original virtual machine that I created. So I'm going to need to make some changes such as host name, and I also need to go ahead and change the SIDs, especially if I want to have domain membership in the future. So in order to do this, I'm going to run a utility called newsid.exe. Now I could have run a utility like sysprep as well, but I like newsid, so I'm going to use that one. I'm going to go through the new SID wizard, which is going to generate a new random SID for me. And I'm going to rename this computer to XP Clone and put some unique identifier on the back of it. And I'll let new SID automatically boot when it finishes its work. So it's going to update my file system, change my system name, give me a new SID, and when it's all done, I'll have a new computer with a unique identity on my network now. And just to show there's no trickery on my part, I put the two virtual machines that I've created side by side. The one to the left is the original virtual machine that I created. And you can see from the identity the virtual machine name, which was some randomly generated name. And then to the right, if we look at this virtual machine, that's the clone that I created with the disk name XP Clone 123. The fastest way to create a virtual machine is to create a copy of an existing virtual machine, then base a new virtual machine on that copy, and then use some utility to regenerate the SID and to change the computer name. A virtual machine. Today we're going to look at some of the different files that make up a virtual machine. So I'm looking today at my host operating system, and I'm looking at my file system of a particular virtual machine that I created. This virtual machine is stored in the c:\vm xp-clone directory, and it's made up of a series of files. It's important to note that right now the virtual machine is currently powered off. The NVRAM file that you see is the BIOS settings of the virtual machine. This is where all of the BIOS related settings for the virtual machine can be found. Right below that, the VMware log file is the log file for the virtual machine that contains a list of workstation activity that had occurred. This is useful when troubleshooting, and it can be opened with an editor such as Notepad, and you can scroll through and read the related items that are in the file. The newest entries are generally always on the bottom of the file. Right below the log file is the VMDK file. Now this is the VMware virtual disk file. The virtual disk acts as the virtual machine's hard drive. Now if you'll notice, this virtual disk is fairly small, only about 1K in size, and there's another virtual disk down below that has a dash flat extension to it. This VMDK file is actually acting as a pointer to this file down here. This file is where all of the data is stored, whereas this file is just simply acting as a pointer describing where that file can be found. This looks a little bit different depending on the type of virtual disk that you create. For example, this virtual disk was created and it pre-allocated all of the disk space. So when I created this virtual machine, I allocated all 8 gigs at one time. If you look at another virtual machine that I created the same 8 gig virtual disk, but I did the space on demand. In other words, I specified that I wanted this disk to grow as data was added to it. And in this case, there is no pointer file for the virtual disk. Instead, all of the data for the virtual machine is stored in the VMDK file. So depending on the type of virtual disk that you choose, the virtual disk might look a little bit different if it's pre-allocated versus growing on demand. The next file to talk about is the VMSD file. The VMSD is a centralized file for storing information about metadata and about snapshots. Well, currently this virtual machine doesn't have any snapshots, so there's really nothing in the file at this point. Then there's the VMX file. The VMX file is the virtual machine's configuration file. This file is also a text file which could be opened with an editor like Notepad. So you can open the file up and you can see the settings that the virtual machine uses. This file is read when the virtual machine is started so that VMware Server knows what type of virtual machine environment to create for this virtual machine. This would have information in it such as where the disk can be found at, whether the CD-ROM is connected, what it's connected to, whether it's an ISO image or something else. Also, it'll have information in it such as the virtual machine's MAC address and the virtual machine's unique identifier. Now when we power on the virtual machine, we're going to notice that we get some new files that get created. Let's go ahead and power on WinXP Clone here. Now that the virtual machine is powered on, let's go back to the directory on the host and look at the virtual machine again. We can see that some files have been added into the virtual machine's directory. The first file that we see is the vmem file. Now, vmem files are the virtual machine's paging file, and they basically back up the guest main memory on the host file system. This file only exists when the virtual machine's running, or in some cases when the virtual machine crashes. This file is not the page file that's used by the guest operating system. This file is used by Workstation as a backup memory location for when the host itself runs low on memory. There are also a few lock files that are added to the directory as well. We see one for the memory and one for the virtual disk. Now, lock files are created to prevent consistency problems on virtual disks and in memory. If the virtual machine did not use locks, then it might be possible for multiple virtual machines to read and write to the disk or to that memory area, and that could cause consistency problems. So when the virtual machine's running, then various lock files get created so that the virtual machine's disk and its memory areas are protected. Now I'm going to return to the virtual machine guest operating system, and from within inside VMware Server's console, I'm going to create a snapshot of this virtual machine by clicking on the snapshot menu and clicking Take Snapshot. I'm going to wait just a moment for the snapshot to complete. Now that the snapshot's complete, we notice that in the directory on the host, where the virtual machine is stored, there are even some more files that have been added to the directory. The first file to take a look at here is the vmsn file, because this is the snapshot state file. It stores the running state of the virtual machine at the time that you take the snapshot. But much like earlier when we looked at the VMDK versus the flat VMDK, this file simply acts as a pointer, and the actual data ends up getting stored in this file with the -0000001.vmdk. So the actual data, the actual changed data on the virtual disk gets stored in this file, and this file down here, the VMSN file, simply acts as a pointer to that file. There's another file to consider, which is the vmem file. This is the actual state of the virtual machine's memory at the time that the virtual machine snapshot was taken. Since this virtual machine has about 256 megs of memory allocated to it, the snapshot is the entire contents of memory at the time that that particular snapshot was taken. There's also a lock file that gets added for the snapshot as well. The final file to talk about is the suspend state file. When I click suspend on the virtual machine, and I go and view the host file system again, I'll see a suspend state file that gets created. The suspend state file stores the state of a suspended virtual machine. When the virtual machine is resumed, this file will be read and the virtual machine will be restored to the state it was when the suspend happened. With VMware Server. So what do we mean by preserving?